the president and First Lady Melania Trump have gone to Iraq to visit the troops. This comes on the heels of a lot of criticism, frankly, over the last 24 hours or so, that he was the first president since 2002 not to visit with the troops. We have gotten a tweet from Sarah Sanders saying President Trump and First Lady traveled to Iraq late on Christmas night to visit with our troops and senior military leadership to thank them for their service, their success, and their sacrifice, and wish them a Merry Christmas. Hans Nichols, who does double duty for us, both at the Pentagon as well as at the White House, tell us what you know.
Well, the president apparently has landed in Iraq, according to Sarah Huckabee Sanders. There are photos from the Reuters news agency that put him in western Iraq at the Al-Assad air base. Now, Chris, that's significant because it's an indication that the president might not be going to Baghdad, where there could be a political conversation about the long-term presence of U.S. troops inside of Iraq. You remember just last week, the president announcing that he's withdrawing 2,000 U.S. troops from Syria. They are there in that region to fight ISIS. The president claiming victory over ISIS, even though the military coalition there just this morning putting out press releases saying that they continue the air campaign against ISIS because that fight is still very much ongoing. So the president finally has visited troops in a war zone. It's taken him almost 2 years into his presidency. You'll recall that with President Barack Obama, he went in April of his first year. President George W. Bush, of course, led the invasion into Iraq, and then he visited Thanksgiving in 2003, starting this tradition of visiting troops during the holidays. President Trump now somewhat belatedly following up on that. Chris?
And of course, it was President Trump who called President Bush's decision to invade Iraq the single worst decision ever made, and many people have sort of put those what they consider to be those mistakes together. People, including supporters of the president, who have been extraordinarily critical of his decision to withdraw troops from Syria. But this is something we have seen from presidents before, right? There is a long history of this. I mean, when I covered the Obama White House, every year at Christmas time, he was in Hawaii. He would go to the Marine Corps base there. Previous presidents have often made these unannounced trips, obviously for security reasons, right?
Yeah, there's a great deal of secrecy on these trips. I've been to several of them with President Obama, both to Iraq and Afghanistan. You can't even tell your spouse, your family, where you're going. Depending on where you land, you either do a corkscrew landing directly in, which minimizes the profile of Air Force One as it's coming down from enemy fire from any potential terrorists that would wish the President of the United States harm. There have been some security lapses. You'll recall that when Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis in 2017 visited Afghanistan, and around the time of his visit, there was a rocket attack on the airport. Now, he wasn't directly in danger, but he was concerned, Secretary Mattis, about operational security. So there is a great deal of security on these trips. The press pool is with the President of the United States. We'll be getting their reports here shortly. And I think we have to see where else he goes. You'll recall that on Thanksgiving, when he talked about visiting the troops, he said he was going to go maybe see some people in Kuwait. You have some 40,000 U.S. troops stationed across the Middle East. Let's see where else he goes. And crucially, Chris, what does President Donald Trump say? Is he going to acknowledge the drawdown in Syria? Could he potentially announce a drawdown from Iraq? You'll recall that he claimed that President Barack Obama was the founder of ISIS for leaving Iraq too soon. We'll see what he says about the U.S.'s long-term commitment. I suspect the Iraqis, as well as U.S. allies, will be listening.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.